All right, so it's not, so the issue, of course, is that in the Bible, right, David is a poet as well as as the king. All right, so it's not, so the issue, of course, is that in the Bible, whoops, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. All right, sorry, everybody. But the issue is, of course, that, when we have poetry in the Bible, by and large, it's more archaic than the language of the surrounding story. So it seems unlikely that a character in the story would have written it, although of course it's possible, right? And also in this case, this is actually this poem is essentially the same as Psalm 18 in Psalms. So that now, of course, which is probably one of the reasons why the tradition says that David was the author of the Psalms, which kind of makes sense. Hold on a second. I'm going to make this a little smaller. I thought I was going to make it smaller. There we go. This is dumb. Sorry, everybody. So we'll read through this. We'll read through this psalm quickly and get a sense of what it says, and then we'll move on. Okay. All right. And David spoke unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him out of the hand of all his enemies and out of the hand of Saul. Right. So we see right away that there's this kind of strange chronological problem. Right. Saul has been dead for a long time. So the question has to arrive, why is this psalm put where it is? I don't have any good answer. I don't know. Does anyone else have a good answer about that?
Well, it seems to be a problem throughout the text. Well, we find somebody killed Goliath at the end here, and it wasn't David.
Right.
And people who are long dead, like here, are all of a sudden alive again. So a bad editor.
Well, yeah, that's actually a great question, right? Is it, I mean, obviously by the standards of book publishing today, right? This is terrible editing, right? And it's embarrassing, right? Who could possibly make such a dumb error, right? On the other hand, there must be some. Well, I mean, let me back up, right? There's obviously different standards for editing as we understand it, and redacting as the ancient redactors of the Bible understood it. Right? Rashi, the great medieval commentator, said there's no before and after in the Bible. Right? So on one hand, you can see that, right, as a kind of excuse for allowing interpreters to say that something that comes farther along in the scroll doesn't necessarily have to be farther along chronologically. But as I've grown as a reader of the Bible, I've begun to understand that he's actually just making kind of a descriptive statement there. He's not making an apologetic statement necessarily, right? He's basically saying, if you're going to read the Bible, you need to understand that that the sequence in the Bible is not the same as a chronological sequence. It just doesn't work that way. Yeah. Go ahead, Jeannie.
Well, God has no beginning. He has no end. He was, he is, he will be.
Right.
But that is a little different. I sort of do expect a little more linear. It's a story, so it's not quite the same. You know, one
Well,
would
it's
expect.
interesting, right? That in specific, I forget what the word is. There's a word for it. Um, in specific sections of the Bible, right? You very often do have a chronological process, right? It's just that the Bible is bigger than that, right? And so if you think of the Bible, I don't know, this is going to maybe sound a little bit too homey, right? But if you think of the Bible as a scrapbook, right, it's almost as though, right, the editors, right, had the story, um, and then they had these other pieces, right? And rather than trying to squeeze these pieces into the chronological frame, which they obviously did with some of the things, right? They decided that this actually comes from an earlier, you know, part of David's career, right? The business about the hand of Saul, right? But it sort of actually really works as a final, as sort of one of the final things that we will read in the book of Samuel, right? Because he says, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, right? And so it ends up sort of feeling like actually the the rhetoric of the poem actually sort of fits the larger context of David's life, right? Rather than the specific incident, right, mentioned in the superscription. I don't know if I'm convincing you, Jeannie, but
Yeah,
not that it matters, but
I'll go with it.
yeah,
You have to go
uh,
with the flow, I think.
right. I mean, I just think it's very interesting, right, that um, there's this sort of willingness, and I've really sort of, it's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this reading of the book of Samuel is sort of really digging in, right, to the fact that there are often multiple versions of things, and that the redactors are very committed to keeping them there. They don't want to give this stuff up. Um, so anyway, so let's continue. So the God who is my rock, in him I take refuge, my shield and my horn of salvation, my high tower and my refuge, my savior, thou savest me from violence. Me, Mechamash, Mechamas Toshieni, right? You take me, you take me out from violence. Praise thy cry is, Lord, I am saved from my enemies. For the waves of death compassed me. The floods of Belial assailed me. Um, the cords of Sheol surrounded me. The snares of death confronted me. Right. So all this language about death, right, that he's going to go back, he's going to go down into the underworld, right? Yet, right, in my distress, I called upon the Lord. Yea, I called unto my God, and out of his temple he heard my voice, and my cry did enter into his ears. Yeah, go ahead, Jeannie.
Well, I'm looking at the text that we've got, and you're reading yours, and that's the same chapter, is it? The Belial, where did that go?
Yeah, that's actually,
Belial, and in our book, it's Sheol.
yeah, well, actually, no, it's really interesting because I just noticed that in verse 5, right, the breakers of death beset me. Okay, the waves of death compass fine. The floods of Belial. I'm not sure what Belial is, but he translates it as the underworld's torrents. Right. So Belial is the underworld here.
Beli means without.
Yeah, believe. Yeah, without. Yeah, yeah, without anything, of nothingness of it. Go ahead, Connie.
In Sonsino, he calls it worthlessness.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, floods, the not the layer, the rivers with, and it's, and you can sort of see that there's like this wordplay here with the lamids and the vavs and the ions. I mean, it's really beautiful poetry.
Yeah.
But so from in my distress, or is as I'll read from Alter, in my strait I called to the Lord, to my God I called, and from his palace he heard my voice, my cry in his ears. Right, this sort of trope, so important in our tradition, right, and important. We're reading now on Wednesdays. We're reading the Book of Judges, right, and this is the sort of constant repetition of the theme. Right? The Israelites get into trouble. They call out to God. God hears them and then sends a deliverer. Right? And here we have David making the same claim. Right? That at a sort of individual / kingly level. Right? He's not. I mean, David is not quite an individual, right? Because he's the king. But there's this same pattern. Right? You cry out to God. And God hears you. That's what God really does, is God hears you, right? And when God hears you, the earth heaved and quaked. The heavens' foundation shuddered, they heaved, for he was incensed, right? Smoke went up from his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth, and coals before him blazed, right? And again, right, that this is, it's interesting again, right, that the Psalms so often will use this frankly anthropomorphic imagery, right? God suddenly he's like a dragon, right? He has smoke coming out of his nostrils, fire out of his mouth, right? It's kind of crazy, right? This image of God as a dragon. But it's obviously an older understanding of God, right? And at this point, it becomes metaphoric, right? Maimonides will say, obviously, God doesn't have nostrils. Obviously, God is not a dragon, right? It's a metaphor for how God reacts to things.
Yeah.
Is it meant as a metaphor here? Was by this author?
I mean, it's clearly a metaphor. Whether the author, who was again probably not David, right, meant it as a representation of God in a human, in a sort of a human body, because that's how he imagined God, or if it was actually, as Maimonides would say, this is the Bible speaking in the language of humans so that we can understand it. It's a hard question for me to answer. I think a lot of biblical scholars would say this is how the author imagined God, right? This was the author's image of God.
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah,
can I ask a strange question? Slightly irrelevant, but not totally. In the Hebrew, is there any kind of, say, apparatus in the poem? So sometimes there's alliteration, sometimes there's rhyme, but sometimes there's internal rhyme. I mean, is there any kind of alliteration in the Hebrew?
Well,
or any kind of apparatus at all?
There actually is more sort of assonance in this poem than is often the case in Hebrew poetry. The primary form of Hebrew poetry, ancient Hebrew poetry, is parallelism, and that you can see in great profusion in this, right? So smoke arose in his nostrils, fire out of his mouth,
right?
Right? And coals flamed forth from him. So these sort of these dyads and triads, right?
Right.
Images building on one another. That's what makes it poetry.
That's very, very common in recited poetry.
Yes, yes.
Now, was this recited as well as written down?
I would assume that a lot of the Psalms, just as they are today, right, were memorized and passed down and performed, right?
Uh-huh.
That would be my assumption with
Yeah.
the
So,
caveat that
so
you never want to take anything I say about these sort of things.
no, but what? So in Old English poetry or in Scandinavian poetry, you really can't take the parallelism too literally. It's just a way for the poet to remember it.
Right. And it's interesting, right? That I do think that is one of the things, right? That in the shift from oral tradition to written tradition, right? The parallelism turns, right? It makes a transition from being a mnemonic, right, to being something that has that carries more meaning than a simple mnemonic.
Okay.
At least in the Hebrew tradition. I can't speak for the English or the Scandinavian. I just don't know enough about it.
Yeah.
But in the Hebrew tradition, that it's been a textual tradition for so many centuries now, right? And the thing, right? I mean, this is the thing about sacred texts, right? Is they're sacred generally not so much because of the texts themselves, but because of the degree to which people treat them as sacred texts, right? And the degree to which we read them and reinterpret and reinterpret and reinterpret.
Right, yeah.
Right. All right, so let's continue, right? So, I'll read the one in the altar book. He bent the heavens, came down, dense beneath his feet, right? The idea of God descending, right? He went out, God is riding an angel. I mean, this is some crazy rhetoric, right? And flew, he soared on the wings of the wind. He set darkness pavilions around him, massing waters, the clouds of the skies. From the radiance before him, fiery coals blazed. The Lord from the heavens thundered, most high sent forth his voice. He let loose arrows and routed them, lightning and struck them with panic. The channels of the sea were exposed, the world's foundation laid bare by the Lord's roaring, the blast of his nostrils breath. What does this sound like?
Flood.
It sounds right. Well, it could be the flood, but I would actually say that this sort of this language of warfare, right, and of laying the world's foundations bare. It sounds to me like this is like the crossing of the Red Sea, right? This is and routing the opposing army, right? This is it. Here, the poet, whether it's David or somebody else, right, is invoking the kind of violence and utter catastrophe that the Egyptians experienced at the Red Sea. Which yet he reached from on high and he took me, he drew me out of the vast waters. Now he's beginning to sound like Jonah. Rescue me from my enemies' spears, from my foes who had overwhelmed me. They sprang against me on my most dire day, but the Lord was a stay then for me. He led me out to an open place and freed me, for he took up my cause. The Lord dealt with me by my merit. This does not sound like David, right? David with all of his sins and his craziness, right? By the cleanness of my hands requited me. Like, when did David have clean hands? Like, it was very early days, right? When David had clean hands, right? Maybe still in the time of Saul, he had clean hands, so that we can sort of justify it from that perspective. Right. For I kept to the ways of the Lord. I did no evil before God. For all his statutes are before me. From his laws I have not swerved. I have been blameless before him. I kept myself from sin. The Lord requited me by my merit, by the cleanness of my hands before his eyes. Right? So
So was this, Rabbi,
Yeah, please.
was this written before or after his sin?
Well, that's a great question, right? And was it another text entirely that had nothing to do with David, but sort of fit this fit the theme of the book, at least until the time of David's escape from Saul, right? And that's why the superscription says this actually wasn't written at the end of David's life. This was written when he escaped from Saul and still hadn't sinned with Bathsheba, right?
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So the answer is I don't know how we would know that. I'm sure that there are scholars who have opinions about this stuff. I'm just not nearly knowledgeable enough to have an opinion.
Rabbi?
Yes, please, Jeannie.
Well, it's sort of interesting that somebody could be without sin. I mean, like I think of Jesus saying, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," implying that that's nobody. That
Right.
nobody could meet that definition. So it's just sort of interesting. He goes on and on about being without sin.
I find it fascinating. That I mean, one thing to say that I was always loyal to God and always tried to follow the rules. It's another thing to say that he's completely without sin, right? Because the entire book of Leviticus is focused on the fact that no matter how hard you try, right, even if you never intentionally commit a sin, it's inevitable, right, that something is going to go wrong. And so you need to know the system, right, in order to reset it. It says if you do any of these sins on purpose, there's nothing you can do, right? So all of the sins that you atone for in the book of Leviticus have to do with things that were, sort of inadvertent. But the whole idea is it's not that people are so sinful and they're terrible, right? It's just that we're human, right? And things are going to go wrong. We're going to make mistakes, and so we have to have a way.
So that's why this seems sort of hubristic.
It does,
I don't
right?
know
It
what
does.
the word
I'm
is.
not a big fan of this part of the psalm, just in general, right? Regardless of whether it fits in this book or not, right? It's this idea of anyone bragging about how sin-free he is.
Only Donald Trump.
I didn't go there,
He
but
would say that. He could
it was
say this
perfect.
prayer.
It was perfect. It was perfect. All right. And then there's more of this kind of business, right? On the next page, with the loyal, you act in loyalty. With the blameless warrior, you are without blame. With the pure, you show your pureness. And with the perverse, you twist and turn. So again, this is I'm not a fan of this. What can I say? I mean, maybe that's immaterial. I'm a fan. I'm not a fan, right? But just to point out, right, that sort of black and white theology causes us a lot of problems. And so it doesn't seem to me to be a very helpful way. That either you're pure or you're perverse. Like there's nothing in between, right? A lowly people you save, you cast your eyes down on the haughty. For you are my lamp, O Lord. The Lord has lit up my darkness. For through you I rush a barrier. Through my God I vault a wall. The God whose way is blameless, the Lord's speech is without taint. A shield he is to those who shelter in him. For who is God but the Lord? Who is a rock but our God? The God, my mighty stronghold, he has freed my ways to be blameless, made my legs like gazelles, and on the heights he has stood me, taught my hand combat, made my arms bend a bow of bronze. You gave me your shield that saved, your battle cry made me many. You lengthened my stride, and my ankles did not shrink. I pursued my foes and destroyed them, never turned back till I cut them down. I cut them down, smashed them. They did not rise. They fell beneath my feet. You girt me with might combat. Those against me you brought down beneath me. You showed me my enemies' nape, my foes, and I blotted them out. Right. So I mean, this makes sense to me as a sort of a song of David, right? Talking about his military success, right? And attributing that success to God. They looked round, there was none to save them, but to the Lord he answered them not. I crushed them like the dust of the earth, like street mud. I pounded them, stomped them. You delivered me from the strife of peoples, kept me at the head of nations. A people I knew did not serve. I knew not did serve me. Foreigners cowered before me. By what the ear heard, they heeded me. Foreigners withered. They crept trembling from their. All right, so probably the less said about that, the better.
Donald Trump.
A little bit, unfortunately, yeah. The Lord lives, and blessed is my rock. Exalt God, rock who saved me. The God who vouchsafes me vengeance and brings down peoples beneath me. Releases me from my enemies, for those who exalt. Over those against me exalts me. From the wreaker of havoc you rescued. Therefore do I praise you, Lord, among nations. And your name do I chant, saving tower to his king, standing steadfast by his anointed, by David and his seed forever. So very interesting, right, at the very end, right? It's this idea, right, that we have in the Bible and we have in rabbinic literature and in sort of popular Jewish lore, right? That the throne of David is eternal, right?
What is eternal? I'm sorry.
The throne of David,
Oh,
right? And there's so much language in rabbinic literature and in sort of, and that's actually one of the big, big pieces of the debate about the historical veracity of the Book of Kings. I mean, I'm sorry, about the Book of Samuel and the Book of Kings, right? Is can Jews look to King David as a real historical national hero, or is this something that is more like the Greek myths, and I think for many of us in the sort of what my teachers would call the post-critical Jewish imagination, it doesn't matter that much, right, in terms of our lived Judaism. But for a lot of people, of course, it's very important. Somehow, if David didn't exist in the way that he's described in the Bible, right, means that this idea of the Tower of Salvation and the everlasting throne of David, right, would somehow be called into question. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but but this is why even though this poetry I don't think means that much in the context of the story, right? It's a very different kind of literary monument than the very sensitive and quite fascinating and psychologically rich story that came before, right? This is a more rhetorical, with a much simpler ideology, right? Still, it's important, I think, from the point of view of subsequent history, right? Because these lines, this very last line, Migdol Yeshuot Malko, right? Chesed Limshicho, right? This is LeDavid Ul Zar. Exactly. So where is that from, Connie?
Benching.
It's from the benching, right? It's from the grace after meals, right? That's
the last line.
It's not the last line, but it's a very important line. And this Magdil, right? Very close to the end, and then you say, "Oh, say shalom bimro mavu ya'aseh shalom Israel amen." Yeah. So go ahead, Connie.
It seems to me that this is all inserted.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this entire poem. So one way that one of my teachers used to describe Jewish literature, and he used this to discuss the Talmud. I don't know that he would include the Bible this way, but it's now reading this book with you, it seems increasingly likely to me that this same principle sort of obtained, right? Is that we've got this old chest, right, that we found in the attic, right? And it has all of these traditions in it, right? It has all these pieces of paper with stories on it. And some of them, right, cohere into a coherent and what's the word I'm looking for? Story where one thing sort of happens in the right order after the other, right? But there's a bunch of materials in that chest.
I think the word is narrative.
Right. So somewhat, but it's not. But a lot of times, right? The pieces that fit into the sort of sequential presentation are not narrative, right? Sometimes they're laws, right? Sometimes they are what's the word when you have oh my gosh, I can't think of the word. A long list of names, right? This one begat this one that begat this one.
Genealogy.
Right? Sometimes they're genealogies. Sometimes they're geographical lists, right? The Bible has a huge range of different genres included within it, right? So it's not. There are narratives to be sure, and those are very, very important. And sometimes they're fragments of narratives, right? Like we had in the previous chapter, right, where we had these 4 little tiny pieces of epic narration about, and where we get confused because all of a sudden someone else has killed Goliath and not David, right? And so yes, I think, Connie, that this was something that was part of the tradition, but it just didn't fit neatly into the presentation of the larger. And so these things are kind of appended. This seems to be Alter's argument, right? That the last 4 chapters or so of the book of Samuel, right, are sort of appendices in a kind of way.
Because this is a psalm also.
Right.
We
It's
can
psalmic.
look at the book of Psalms and locate it exactly.
Right. Exactly. All right. And so I'm going to push us through so we can hopefully get through to the end quickly. All right. So chapter 23, these are the last words of David. All right. Which again are very, very interesting. Right. So now we have another poem. Right. And Alter says, is this one like the previous one is archaic also? Right. Also old. And it's in here, it said that this is the last, this is sort of the deathbed poem of David, even though we're going to meet the aged David at the very beginning of the book. So thus spoke David, son of Jesse, thus spoke the man raised on high, anointed of the God of Jacob and the sweet singer of Israel, right? So this is where we get this idea, right? That, I mean, also obviously from the narrative sections of the book, where it says that, you know, David was very good on the harp and was a great singer, right? But here he is the Zmirot Yisrael, right? He has the sweet songs of Israel. Go ahead, Jeannie.
Oh, I was thinking of the word ne'emah or something.
Yeah, Aman, yeah, Iman. Yeah, pleasant, right? Yeah. Here they're translating as sweet, but I think he's translating it as sweet because that's how, I'm assuming that's how King James translates it, King James Bible. And very often Alter wants to keep the King James translation. Yes, he actually says that. This is the eloquent and famous wording of the King James Version. It seems worth retaining because the divergent proposals for understanding the phrase are scarcely more certain than that. All right. The Lord's Spirit has spoken in me, his utterance on my tongue. And so very interesting, right, that here we have a different version of David. Right? In the previous one, he was the perfect guy, right, who won all the battles. And here he's like the incredibly fortunate vessel of God's word. Right? The God of Israel has said to me, the rock of Israel has spoken. He who rules men just, who rules in the fear of God. Like morning's light when the sun comes up, morning without clouds, from radiance, from showers, grass from earth. For is not thus my house with God? An eternal covenant he gave me. Again, this idea, right, of David's eternal covenant with God. Right? Obviously, that the covenant will be broken as soon as Solomon dies, right? But its eternity is also is never lost in the Jewish imagination, right? An eternal covenant he gave me, drawn up in full and guaranteed. For all my triumph and all my desire, will he not bring to bloom? Right? We always can trust that God will eventually bring this covenant back into force. And the worthless man is like a thorn, uprooted every one. They cannot be picked up by hand. Should a man touch them, he must get himself iron or the shaft of a spear, and in fire they'll be utterly burned where they are. All right.
Rabbi, excuse me.
Yeah.
What is David's covenant with God? I don't remember.
I mean, it appears, right, that David's covenant with God is that if he follows God's commandments, right, that his kingdom shall be everlasting. Right
And
now,
that's sort of the Jews' covenant with God, isn't it? You will be
it
my people if you keep my law. You will be
yeah,
my people,
like
and I will be your God.
it's an extension of the Jews' covenant with God, right? But the Jews' covenant with God never included, at least in the Torah, any talk about a king, right? It was always about the Jews and God. It was not about the Jews having a king that would that would that would inhabit the throne or a castle, right? It was always about the kingdom of God, not about the kingdom of David, right? So that's what's sort of innovative about these passages, right? That there's a covenant specifically with David that stands in for the covenant with God. I mean, I'm sorry, that stands in for the covenant of the Jews. And so when, like it's an issue today, right? Even, what is the covenant that God has with the Jews? Is it really, right, that we are going to, that the Jews are going to occupy the land of Canaan as promised in the Bible? And is that going to be the maximal of the land of Canaan, or is it going to be a more minimal version of it, right? And which is the danger, right, of using a sacred text as a historical text,
Hmm.
right? All right, but that's a great question. These are the names of the warriors of David: Yosef Bathsheba, very interesting. A Tahkemonite, head of the three. He is a Dino the Enzite. He brandished his spear over 8 slain at a single time. After him, Eleazar, son of Dodo, son of Ahohi, of the three warriors with David when they insulted the Philistines, gathered there for battle. And the Israelites decamped. He arose and struck down Philistines until his hand tied. And his hand stuck to the sword, right? He couldn't even get the sword out of his hand. And the Lord brought a great victory on that day. And the troops came back after him only to strip the slain. And after him, Shammah, son of Agag, the Arite. And the Philistines gathered at Lehi, and there was a plot of land, and they're full of lentils. And the troops had fled before the Philistines. And he took a stand in the plot and saved it and struck down the Philistines. And the Lord wrought a great victory. And so it kind of goes on this way. And it's kind of it's just this ends up being kind of a list, right? Just a list of the men who were military heroes, right? And actually, Alters says that this list, right, it's just a list with various little snippets of narrative, no consistent narrative, right? And it says it's perhaps the strongest candidate of any passage in the book of Samuel to be considered a text actually written in David's lifetime. And the fact that it's almost impossible to understand it makes it more likely that it's super ancient and very and thus kind of impossible to understand.
Bye.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a little tiny question.
Yeah.
The son of Dodo, that doesn't sound very Hebrew.
No, it doesn't.
And so I'm looking over here in the Hebrew. Is that Dodo or could that be
Let's see.
Dodi?
Yeah. Rav Elazar ben. Actually, you're pointing out something really
Oh, and it says Dodo, but they're putting a Vav in there.
right. And so, right, the master.
Yud. A Yud.
So the Masoretes very often had to decide what words meant or how to pronounce words that made no sense, right? Because the Masoretes inherited a text, right, that had no vowels, right? And very often they would decide that, oh, that yud must just be a vav that didn't get written, written all the way down to the bottom of the line. So they get this word ben dadai is the best you could sort of do with it, right? And they say, oh, well, dadai doesn't make any sense, so let's make it dodo, which to our ears doesn't sound any better, but maybe to them it did sound better. I have no idea.
Yeah.
It's just so hysterical how you just all this.
So they're making up names. We should know about that.
Exactly. They just make up names. All right. So there might.
Well, we're frozen.
Yeah, I don't hear anything.
No, everyone's frozen, but you and me.
Oh,
Hi,
okay.
Phyllis.
Might be something interesting
there
in this,
you
but
are.
not interesting enough for us.
Rabbi,
You know?
I'm sorry, you were frozen and we couldn't hear what you were saying for a moment.
I'm sorry. What I was saying was not interesting. All I was saying was that the rest of this material in chapter 24 is not that interesting for us.
Oh, okay.
That's interesting to hear.
Yeah, and I think we can. So here's the last chapter of the book of Samuel again, right? And author sort of points out once again that this narrative is very unlike the previous narratives, right? Where there's a great deal of sort of psychological acuity and even if we don't really believe that God brings this or that against people in the world, right? There's great complexity, right? And here this is here there's just here we have this sort of situation where God just sort of randomly does something. He is suddenly angry at Israel and there's no reason given.
God made him do it.
What?
Because God caused them to do it.
Right. I mean, that's the thing is God seems to sort of insist that they do a census and then they do the census and then God is mad that they did the census. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of a mystery. Why? So as Alter puts it, the God of this story has the look of acting arbitrarily, exacting terrible human costs in order to be placated. Right. Unlike the deity of basically the entire book of Samuel, he is decidedly an interventionist God, pulling the human actors by strings, and he may well be a capricious God, right, who incited David to carry out a sentence that will only bring grief to the people, right? So again, this again appears to be a tradition, right, a traditional story that even though it has this kind of really unpleasant God who is acting in this kind of fire and brimstone Old Testament kind of way, right? For whatever reason, the redactors thought they couldn't jettison it. Right?
I don't understand why it's so terrible to take a census.
Neither do I. And especially since that's how the book of Numbers starts, right? That God tells Moses and the Israelites to take a census.
Yeah.
But somehow taking a census is a bad thing. Go ahead, Connie.
So is this where the custom of not enumerating people comes from? Because last Shabbos, I said to a guy, so how many grandchildren do you have now? And he was so affronted. And he said, I don't know exactly.
Oh, my God.
He couldn't come up with a number.
Well,
right? Is that it?
As long as he knows how many children he has, that's the important thing.
Although I heard a story today about a kid. I mean, I guess he was 70 when he told this story, but the guy said that when he was a kid, his father was such a toxic presence, and his mother was just completely out to lunch, that this kid, learned pretty quickly that the best thing for him to do was just to leave the house early in the morning every day and come back at night, and no one ever noticed that he was gone.
Jeez.
So I think you do probably want to count your kids, at least make sure they're all there.
Time to time. But is it possible that it's bad to count people because is that sort of like the evil eye or
Right. I mean,
Yeah, well,
people?
Walter says that, but it turns out only to have been a census of able-bodied military men.
Right, exactly. And yes, I mean, my sense is that it's the evil eye because there are these stories in the Bible, where a census leads to disaster. And so, but but more than that, I really can't say why there was this idea, right, that that a census is going to lead to God's wrath. Beyond me. All right, so God said, right, he moved David against them. I mean, so interesting, right? Saying, go number Israel and Judah. And the king said to Joab, the captain of the host that was with him, go now to and fro among all the tribes of Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know the sum. And Joab here says, dude, now the Lord thy God add unto the people how many soever they may be, 100-fold, and may the eyes of the Lord of my Lord the king see it. But why doth my Lord the king delight in this thing? Right. So Joab again, and this is very interesting, right? There's often Joab is the guy, despite all of his violent conflicts, who's willing to sort of address David and say, this doesn't make any sense. But nonetheless, right, the king's word prevailed, and against the captain of the host. And Joab and the captains of the host went out from the presence of the king to number the people. And they passed over the Jordan and pitched in Aroer on the right side, and so on and so forth. And they came and they did all right, and they went all around, and they gave the sum of the numbering of the people. This is verse 9 unto the king. And there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000. All right, so, and David's heart smote after that. After that, he had numbered, right? So he sort of now regrets it. But it is, but it is interesting. I don't know, are these numbers in any way accurate? I have no idea. I have my. And David said unto the Lord, right? All of a sudden, he said, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, put away, I beseech thee, the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly. Very interesting, right? Because this is completely at odds from what we had in chapter 22, right? Where David is bragging about how blameless he is and how he never went against the laws of God, right? And here he is confessing him.
But have we decided why it was such a sin?
I'm sorry?
Have we decided why it was such a sin?
No, I don't have a sense of why it's such a sin. I don't remember if. Yeah. Right. So and Alter points this out, right, as being a problem. Verse 10, Alter says, in contrast to the cogent sense of moral agency and moral responsibility in the David story proper, there is a peculiar contradiction. David confesses deep contrition, yet he has been manipulated by God, incited, right, to do what he has done. He didn't do it on his own volition. He didn't come up with. I mean, it wasn't even his idea. So not just that we don't know why it's such a sin, we also don't know why he's being blamed for following God's demands. God here seems like a capricious and even evil God, right? Suddenly bringing punishment against people for doing what God. I mean, unless it's sort of like an Abraham and Isaac kind of a story where he's actually not supposed to do it. I don't know, but it's very complicated.
I mean, why
I-
did God say it was a sin? I mean, why? Okay, never mind, go
Yeah,
on.
I really wish I could tell you, Connie. I don't get it. I've never understood.
Okay,
And
okay,
I'm sure we could find some Jewish teacher somewhere that would tell you why it's a sin.
all right,
But I would
Okay.
still say I don't get it. All right. And when David rose up in the morning, the word of the Lord came unto the prophet Gad, the seer, saying, Go and speak unto David. Thus saith the Lord, I lay upon thee 3 things. Choose thee one of them that I may do it unto thee. Right? Again, this is like completely crazy. Not only is God punishing David for something God told him to do, he's basically like doing this choose your own adventure kind of punishment,
Right, right.
which also makes no sense, right? So God came to David and told him and said unto him, Shall 7 years of famine come unto thee in the land? Or wilt thou flee 3 months before thy foes while they pursue thee? Or shall there be 3 days pestilence in our land? Now advise thee. What? And here what answer I shall return to him that sent me. It's like, I don't get this at all. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Pick one, anyone.
Right, exactly. You just pick a door, pick a door to go be.
Well, could this be some kind of a way of explaining the inexplicable?
I mean, I think yes. I think yes. And I think, but I also think, I mean, I would actually say I mean, and you could make an argument, maybe, Phyllis, that it's making an argument that it's making sort of the sense that is that in this sort of weird sense, we choose our own punishments, like what befalls us. Sort of, it's not necessarily our fault, right? It's like the world kind of conspires against us, but still, the choices we make have a way of influencing what happens to us. I mean, I don't know. I mean, but it's very interesting. So just to point out that this verse 14 is like the verse that Connie sang, right? This one is less widespread, but it's also a very important verse in the liturgy. And David said unto Gad, right? I am in a great strait. Sarli me'od, right? Let us fall now to the hand of God, right? For his mercies are great. And let me not fall into the hand of man. Let me sort of plead my case to God, hope and put my hope in God's mercies, because I know that a person, right? It's actually not man, it's a dam, right? It's a person. A person will not have any mercy on me. And this is the opening line of a section of the liturgy called Tachanun, which is sort of like supplication. And it is regularly said in the morning and in the afternoon. And it's sort of like a kind of a confession of sins, right? Of our own. And I in particular, like, despite the fact that I really don't like this chapter, when I was becoming a rabbi, I found this particular verse in its liturgical setting to be a very powerful one. And so anyway, just that's maybe neither here nor there, but just to let you know that this is one of the verses in the Bible, right? That is recited again and again and again by
Which verse are you talking about?
verse
14?
by observant and traditional Jews, right?
Which
Not
chapter
like,
are you talking about?
like the one that
6,
Connie sang, which is sung by pretty much all Jews who have recited the Birkat Hamazon, right? Which is something that cuts across all of the Jewish traditions.
That
But
14?
yeah, but verse 14, you'll find it only in traditional conservative congregations and Orthodox congregations, right? And many traditional congregations don't even. I mean, I'm sorry, many conservative congregations don't even. Right, and so very interesting, right? So what does David decide?
pestilence.
It's for 3 days.
He doesn't decide, right? I mean, I think
The
that
Lord decides it.
what?
But see, it says in Sonsino that David rationalizes. If he says war, then people will think, oh, well, he's protected.
Right,
If he says famine, oh, well, David will have enough food. But pestilence will affect everybody,
right,
even the king.
right. So Sonsino here, right, is quoting the Midrash,
Yeah,
right? So this is how the rabbis made sense of the fact that David doesn't actually answer, right? So what David read, at a sort of at the sort of idiomatic level, right? Gad comes to David and says, "Choose one," and David said, I'm in great distress. I don't know what to say. Let God decide," is basically what he's saying. Let God decide because I would actually do the Midrash one better, Connie, and I would say if it gets out, right, that I chose one of these,
yeah.
I chose one of the punishments,
Yeah.
right, then I'm going to fall into the hands of men, and they will judge me and hate me and depose me. But if this is God's decision,
Yeah.
right, then it's in the hands of God. It's an act of God, as we say in modern parlance, right? So, right, God has to decide. David, I think, is smart here. He doesn't decide, which that little interpretation makes this little story a little bit more palatable to me. Right? So the Lord said a pestilence, right? And there died of the people from Dan even to Beersheba 70,000 men. Whoa. Right?
And that's because of a census?
Well, very interesting.
Pestilence.
They counted the live people and then they counted the dead ones. I mean, did they not learn anything? But here also very interesting, right? Vayishlach yado hamalach Yerushalayim l'shachatach vayinachem Adonai el hara'ah. Right? Very interesting, right? And when the angel stretched out his hand towards Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord repented him of the evil.
Is that sort of like
After it's
Jonah,
all
when
done.
God says, I changed my mind, I don't want to destroy these people, and this is my creation, I don't want to destroy. God,
Well,
he has mercy.
there may be other examples, but the one this one reminds me of is the book of Jonah, right? Where
Jonah,
God
that's what I
changes
said.
God's mind and decides that because the people of Nineveh repented, he no longer wants to destroy the city.
Right, right.
Right. So he says it's enough, right? And very interesting. Now it gets very, very surreal, right? And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And David spoke unto the Lord when he saw the angel that smote the people, and said, Lo, I have sinned, and I have done iniquitously. But these sheep, what have they done? This again reminds me of Jonah, right? The very end of Jonah, God says there's all these people in Nineveh who don't know their right hands from their left, right? And all these cattle and beasts as well, that I don't want to kill, right? So here he's saying, I understand I've sinned, and so kill all people, but these sheep, what have they done? Right? Let thy hand, I pray thee, be against me and against my father's house, and not the livestock. And Gad came that day to David and said unto him, Go up, rear an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And David went up according to the saying of God, as the Lord commanded. And Araunah looked forth and saw the king and his servants coming on toward him. And Araunah went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, Wherefore is the Lord the king come to his servant? And David said, To buy the threshing floor of thee, to build an altar up unto the Lord, that the plague may be stayed from the people. And Araunah said unto David, Let my lord the king take and offer up what's good unto him to hold the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing instruments and the furniture of the production of the oxen for the wood. All of this did Araunah the king give unto the king. I'm not sure what that means. That doesn't make sense to me. That's in that version. Hold on. All of it has Araunah, O king, given to the king. And Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God show you favor. And the king said to Araunah, no, not so. I will surely buy it from you for a price, and I will not offer up burnt offerings to the Lord my God at no cost. Right? Very important, right? This is like Abraham buying the cave at Machpelah. Right? He's not going to take it for free. He's going to pay for it. He's going to have a deed for it, and so on and so forth. So he can't say that it was forced, right? And David bought the threshing floor in the auction for 60 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar to the Lord and offered up burnt offerings and communion sacrifices. And the Lord granted the plea for the land, and the scourge was pulled back from Israel.
Chazak, chazak.
Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek.
Yes.
Right. All right. So very, very interesting, right? And I have to wonder, I don't know, but I have to wonder, right? Does this threshing floor end up being the site of the temple? Right? And is this sort of one of the reasons why this story ends up in this book? Right? Because we need to know that this became sort of the way that the king purchased the land on which the temple would be eventually used. So, but very interesting, right? How it suddenly shifts from kind of Jonah and Aesop language, right, to kind of Abraham story, right, with the buying and like the fact that the destroyer is sent away is kind of like an apple in the end of this little passage.
So Rabbi, so the pestilence didn't happen.
It did happen. It killed 70,000 people.
Oh
But
yeah, what happened? Oh, but this plague or different plague?
no, this is the same thing.
Came to an end. I
It
guess.
came to an end. Okay,
It-
70,000.
If you want to end a plague, that's what you have to do.
Right? Like, but where it reached Jerusalem, interestingly, it was this threshing floor. Right? The destroying angel, who had already killed 70,000 people, right? He goes up to Jerusalem to kill people in Jerusalem, and God says, "Go take a break, right? No more here, right?" And David goes out to the angel in this place and says, "I need to build an altar here because this is where it's at, right? This is where God took mercy on us." So, is this sort of a Deuteronomic sort of sense of this where God chooses to have God's name be established? I'm not really sure, right? But it is interesting, right, that we will soon have in the beginning of the next chapters. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we will have talk about David is going to want to build the temple, and he's going to know that he will not be building the temple, but his so, anyway, to be continued.
Thank you.
All right. So,
Thank you, Rabbi.
everybody. Next,
Okay.
we'll read the first 2 chapters of the Book of Kings. Please bring some cookies to our meeting so we can, so we can celebrate whenever we finish a substantial piece of study. We should always have a siyum, a little ceremony party. So I don't know if we'll actually finish. I hope we will. And
Who knows what this week will bring? Do you have any words of Jewish wisdom to carry us through the week?
Ay, ay, ay.
That's pretty good.
Oh yeah. You may need more than a week to carry you through.
No, there's tomorrow night. All I would say is that is like everything else, right? I mean, and I think we have this sort of idea, right, that our institutions should be predictable, that you know that these last forever. You know, nothing really lasts forever. It's just sort of a question of
Mm.
how are we going to react to the changes. And so far, you know, what makes me crazy, right, is that some of the more positive changes in our country have elicited responses from many many of our co-citizens that have demonstrably worked. And so I think it's a matter of saying, you know, that we sort of as a collective have we have ideals, and we have sort of a way that we envision our lives, and the life of our country being, and that even when we end up in these sort of places of adversity, right, we have to remember that we need to continue living the life that's important to us. You know, there's been all kinds of times in Jewish history where Jews were encouraged to abandon Judaism, or encouraged to abandon their life, and each sort of needs to make a decision about how to proceed. I think what's so remarkable to me, though, is that how sort of to um, loyalty to sort of Jewish identity, um, in our case today, right? Loyalty to our democratic, and I don't mean democratic like the Democratic Party. I mean like
Small d.
our country. That's what we need to be loyal to. And even if they're under siege, we should be loyal to them and work for them. Have the
Can
kind
I
of.
ask,
Go ahead.
can I ask you, when before have you ever seen barriers erected around the White House before an election?
Ridiculous.
And the people are boarding up their shops and businesses?
I mean, what the president has wrought is
Unbelievable.
distressing beyond belief.
So awful, so awful.
I just want to still hold out hope for our country and for our ability to endure under the attack we're experiencing. And that it's, you know, without, again, it's going to be a major setback, but I think the worst thing for us to do is to let our mourning turn into you know, fatalism or unredeemable.
Unredeemable what?
That we, you know, unreversible despair.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Right? We can still resist, still work for the better, right? And focus. I think again, focus our work locally in our community, right? And just continue to live in the way that we feel is right and virtuous. Includes everybody.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Breaking up, Rabbi.
Yeah.
I'm going to say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Live
you.
Tov, everybody.
Lila Tov.
I'm having a glass of wine right now.
Sounds like a good
Bye-bye.
idea.
Good night, Connie. L'chaim to Connie.
Good night, everybody.
Night.